There is a town in West Texas where the post office still has a zip code, but there are no people left to use it. The buildings are standing. The church is still standing. The school is still standing. But the doors have been locked for decades, and the land around them is posted with signs that say, "No trespassing," in letters large enough to read from the road. That town is not unique. Texas has hundreds of ghost towns scattered across its 268,820 square miles, and a surprising number of them are completely off limits to the public. Not because there is nothing to see, because there is too much, and what remains is either too dangerous, too legally complicated, or too carefully guarded to let strangers wander through unsupervised. These are not ghost towns with a historical marker on an empty lot. These are places with intact buildings, buried histories, and active ownership that has decided the public does not get access. Some are on private ranch land. Some are protected as hazardous sites. Some are military property that was never returned to civilian use. And some exist in that peculiar Texas legal territory where the land has been in the same family for 150 years, and the family sees no reason to share it with anyone. We are counting down 13 ghost towns in Texas that you are not allowed to visit, from abandoned railroad stops, to flooded communities, to Cold War military installations that the government has quietly decided to forget about. If you want to know what Texas looks like when it stops pretending everything is open for business, stay with us. Number 13. Lobo. There is a ghost town in Culberson County, between Van Horn and Sierra Blanca on the old Southern Pacific line, that most Texans could not find on a map. Lobo was established in the 1880s as a railroad water stop, grew into a small agricultural community supported by dry land farming and cattle, and then collapsed when the railroad's priorities shifted and the water ran out. The population peaked somewhere around 40 people, which is not impressive by any measure. But the buildings that remain are intact enough to make Lobo look less like a ghost town and more like a town that simply walked away one afternoon and never came back. The problem is that Lobo sits on private ranch land, and the current owner has posted the entire area. No trespassing signs are positioned at every approach. There is no visitor access, no historical site designation that would require public accommodation, and no indication that this will change. From the highway, I can see the outlines of the structures. That is as close as you are getting. Number 12. Indianola. Indianola was once the second largest port in Texas. That sentence requires a moment, because most people who have heard of Indianola at all know it only as a cautionary tale about building a city on a barrier peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico. The town was founded in 1846, grew rapidly as an entry point for German and Czech immigrants flooding into the hill country, and at its peak had a population of over 5,000 people, a courthouse, hotels, warehouses, and a Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels, who briefly used it as his base of operations for establishing New Braunfels. Then came the hurricanes. The storm of 1875 killed several hundred people and destroyed much of the town. The people who survived rebuilt. The storm of 1886 was worse. It reduced Indianola to ruins, and then, for good measure, what the wind left standing the subsequent fire took. The survivors did not rebuild. They left. Today, Indianola is partially underwater, partially on private land, and the Calhoun County Navigation District controls access to most of what remains. There is a historical marker near the water. There is also a whole drowned city beneath the water that you cannot reach without a boat, an explicit permission that is not easy to obtain. Number 11. Shafter. Shafter is a different kind of inaccessible. The town itself, tucked into the Chinati Mountains in Presidio County about 60 miles south of Marfa, still has a handful of residents and technically qualifies as an inhabited community. But the silver mine that built it, the Presidio mine, operated from 1882 until 1942, and then again briefly in the 1970s, and the industrial infrastructure surrounding the mine site is posted and fenced as a hazardous area. The mine tailings contain heavy metals. The old processing facilities are structurally unstable. Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has been involved in various assessments of the site over the years, and the result is that the most historically significant portions of Shafter, the mine workings themselves, the mill, ruins, the industrial core that once made this one of the most productive silver operations in American history, are completely off limits. You can drive through what remains of the residential area. You can look at the old church. The mine is another matter entirely. Number 10. Terlingua Ranch Ghost Town. Not to be confused with the Terlingua that hosts the famous chili cook-off, though they are in the same general region. The original Terlingua mining settlement is a complicated landscape of ruins, active property, and posted land that most visitors misunderstand completely. The cinnabar mines that produced mercury for World War I munitions employed hundreds of workers in the early 20th century. When the mines played out, the workers left. The company town collapsed. What remains is a mixture of ruins on land managed by different entities, some accessible, some emphatically not, and sections of the original mining district that sit on private property with no public easement. The owners of those sections are not interested in hosting visitors. He landscape looks open because West Texas always looks open. It is not. Several travelers have discovered this by walking past clearly posted signs and being asked to leave by people who were not interested in negotiating. Number 9. Eliasville. There is a town in Young County that exists on county maps, but does not exist in any meaningful way that would allow you to visit it. Eliasville was established in the late 1800s along the Brazos River, grew to a modest size as a farming and ranching supply point, and then entered a long, slow decline after the county seat was confirmed elsewhere, and the railroad decided to route through Graham instead. The population today is technically non-zero, but just barely. What makes Eliasville significant for this list is that the original town site, the area with the oldest buildings and the most concentrated historical evidence of the community's existence, sits on private ranch property. The current landowner is not operating a historical site. There is no guided access, no scheduled tours, and no indication that strangers are welcome. The old buildings visible from the county road are standing. That view from the road is the entire tour. Number 8. Presidio La Bahía, Outer Works. This requires clarification because Presidio La Bahía in Goliad is absolutely open to the public and is one of the best preserved Spanish colonial fortifications in North America. The mission complex, the chapel where the Goliad massacre unfolded, the Angel of Goliad Memorial, all of it is accessible and maintained. What is not accessible is the surrounding land containing the outer defensive works, the remains of the broader colonial community that supported the Presidio, and the archaeological sites that researchers have identified in the area. Those sites sit on private ranch land, adjacent to the historic site proper, and landowner permission would be required to access them. The Presidio is extraordinary. The full extent of what surrounds it remains locked behind fences that were there long before Texas history tourism became an industry. Number 7. Kimball County's Pegleg Crossing. In the hill country of Kimball County, along the South Llano River, there is an old crossing point that once served as a significant travel route during the frontier period. The settlement that developed around it, supporting travelers, providing basic services, sustaining a small permanent population, is gone now. The buildings that remain are on private ranch property. The land around the crossing has been held in agricultural use for generations, and the families who own it have not historically been interested in opening their property to historical tourists. This is not an unusual situation in Texas. What makes Pegleg Crossing particularly frustrating is that the historical record suggests it was the site of at least 2 significant Comanche engagements during the frontier period, and the physical evidence of those encounters, the archaeology beneath the ground, almost certainly remains largely intact. Access requires negotiating directly with private landowners who may or may not respond to requests. Number 6. Indian Hot Springs. Down in Hudspeth County on the Rio Grande, there is a property with genuine hot springs, ruins of a bathhouse resort that operated in the early 20th century, and a history that stretches back through indigenous use to a period well before Spanish colonization. Indian hot springs attracted visitors in the 1920s and 1930s who believed the mineral water had curative properties, which is a pattern that repeats across West Texas with remarkable frequency. The resort closed. The property passed through various hands. Today, it is privately owned and occasionally advertised in various stages of attempted revival, but public access has been inconsistent at best and non-existent at worst. The ruins of the original bathhouse structures are on the property. The spiritual DJs still flow. Whether any of that is accessible on a given day depends entirely on the current owner's situation, which is not a reliable foundation for planning a visit. Number 5. Thurber. Thurber is a partial exception to this list, and the exception is worth explaining. The town was a completely company-owned coal mining community from the 1880s through the 1920s, one of the most thoroughly controlled industrial towns in Texas history. At its peak, Thurber had 10,000 residents, all of them renting from the Texas and Pacific Coal Company, which owned every building, every street, and every supply source in the entire town. When coal gave way to petroleum and the mines closed, the company literally dismantled the town. They sold the bricks, moved the structures, and left almost nothing standing except a smokestack and a hilltop cemetery. The smokestack is visible from Interstate 20. The cemetery is the part that is inaccessible. The Thurber Cemetery sits on property that has been the subject of ongoing legal and ownership questions, and access to visit the graves of Thurber's former residents is not straightforward. The company that eliminated the town could not eliminate the dead, but the arrangements around the cemetery have not made visitation simple. Number 4. La Salle's Fort St. Louis site. In 1685, René Robert Cavalier de La Salle established a French colony on Matagorda Bay that was almost immediately a catastrophe. The colonists died of disease, were killed by the Karankawa, and suffered through supply failures that would have broken a less stubborn man, which is possibly what eventually broke La Salle, since his own men murdered him in 1687. The fort site was rediscovered and excavated in the 1990s by Texas Historical Commission archaeologists, and that excavation produced one of the most significant colonial-era finds in American history, including La Salle's ship La Belle, which was recovered from the bay floor. The actual fort site today is on private ranch land near Vanderpool in Victoria County. The Texas Historical Commission has worked with the landowner, and some controlled access has existed for research purposes, but casual public visitation to the original site is not available. The history is extraordinary. The access is not. Number 3. Granite Mountain Military Reservation ruins. During World War II, the federal government established various training and support facilities across Texas, some of which were built in locations that were subsequently absorbed into other land uses and then quietly forgotten. Several of these sites exist in various states of ruin on land that was never fully returned to public access, either because it was transferred to private ownership with deed restrictions, retained by federal agencies with no public program, or simply posted and locked without formal designation of any kind. The specific infrastructure involved: barracks foundations, storage structures, utility corridors, represents a category of historical site that the federal government has not prioritized for preservation or access. The result is ghost town infrastructure from a ghost institutional moment, inaccessible and largely undocumented for public purposes. Number 2. Downie. In Baylor County in North Texas, Downie is the kind of ghost town that local historians know about and virtually nobody else does. The town developed briefly in the early 20th century, sustained a small population through agricultural activity, and then declined as the surrounding farming economy contracted, and the nearest larger towns absorbed its commercial functions. The physical remains of Downie sit on private agricultural land that is actively farmed. The landowners are using the property. They are not running a heritage tourism operation. Historical markers in Baylor County reference the general settlement history of the area, but standing in the actual location where Downie existed would require permission from people who have their own reasons to be cautious about strangers on their land. This is the pattern across rural Texas. The land never stopped being used. The towns stopped being towns. Those two facts coexist in a way that does not leave room for casual visitors. Number 1. Indianola's flooded core and the submerged community of Lake Medina shores. The distinction here matters. Lake Medina, created by Medina Dam in 1913, flooded a valley in Bandera County that contained not only farmland, but the physical remains of earlier settlement infrastructure. When reservoir levels drop significantly during drought conditions, which happens in South Texas, outlines of foundations and structural remnants become visible beneath the water. The land those remnants sit on is either under the jurisdiction of the Bexar Medina Atascosa County's Water Improvement District or adjacent private land, and access to the lakebed during low water events that expose the ruins is not formally organized as a public historical activity. People have seen the exposed structures from boats. Getting onto the lakebed to examine them directly is a different question with a less clear answer. Texas has dozens of flooded communities beneath its reservoirs. Medina is one of the more accessible by water and one of the more complicated by law. The ruins surface when the drought gets bad enough. The question of who has standing to walk among them does not have a simple answer. And in Texas, land questions without simple answers tend to resolve in favor of whoever holds the deed.